Welcome back to the Emma podcast. I'm Eric, and as always, I'm joined by Anna. Today, we're discussing a topic that's becoming increasingly important across life sciences organizations as digital transformation accelerates, and that's AI governance. More specifically, how companies are balancing innovation with compliance, risk management, and regulatory expectations as artificial intelligence becomes more integrated into regulated environments.
And this is one of those areas where adoption is moving very quickly, but governance frameworks are still catching up. Organizations are implementing AI across research, clinical operations, quality systems, and even broader operational functions. But once those systems start influencing regulated processes, questions around oversight and accountability become much more important.
I agree, Anna. Our team at Emma International was working with a global life science organization expanding the use of AI across multiple parts of the business. The technology itself wasn't the issue. In many cases, the systems were performing well and creating operational efficiencies. The challenge was around structure. Leadership needed a clearer understanding of how AI systems were being governed, how risks were being managed, and how those systems aligned with evolving regulatory expectations.
And that's where things can become complicated pretty quickly because AI doesn't fit neatly into traditional governance models. These systems evolve over time, they rely heavily on data, and they often influence decision making in ways that aren't always easy to explain or trace. So organizations start asking questions like, who owns the model? How are updates controlled? What level of validation is required? How do we demonstrate oversight during an inspection?
You're right, and those questions become even more important in regulated environments. Because once AI starts influencing quality decisions, clinical processes, or operational activities tied to compliance, regulators expect those systems to operate within a controlled framework. And that's where the client was facing growing uncertainty. There was concern around transparency, around explainability, and around how to manage AI systems consistently across different functions within the organization.
And at the same time, there were broader operational risks emerging as adoption increased. Things like data integrity, model reliability, cybersecurity exposure, bias management, and change control all became part of the discussion. Because unlike more traditional systems, AI introduces a different level of complexity around how outputs are generated and how those outputs evolve over time.
Right? And I think that's one of the biggest shifts organizations are still adapting to. With traditional validated systems, you generally expect a level of consistency unless a formal change is introduced. With AI, models can evolve, data sets can change, and performance can shift depending on how the system is being used. That doesn't mean the systems are unreliable, but it does mean oversight needs to be more dynamic.
I agree, Eric. And that's where the Emma team became involved. The goal wasn't simply to review individual AI tools, it was to help the organization develop a scalable governance framework that could support long term AI adoption while still aligning with regulatory and operational expectations. And that required looking at AI not as isolated technology, but as part of the broader quality and compliance ecosystem.
So, one of the first priorities was establishing governance structures, defining ownership, oversight responsibilities, escalation pathways, and decision making processes related to AI enabled systems. Because without clear accountability, it becomes very difficult to demonstrate control.
And that accountability needs to extend across the entire life cycle of the system, not just development, but deployment, monitoring, updates, and ongoing oversight.
That is great insight, Anna. And that life cycle perspective became a major part of the framework. Emma worked with our client to establish structured processes around AI model development, validation, deployment, performance monitoring, and change management. The idea was to create consistency across the organization, rather than having different teams managing AI independently in different ways.
And that consistency matters a lot as adoption scales because what starts as a small number of use cases often expands quickly. more systems get introduced, more teams begin using AI, and the operational footprint grows. Without a standardized framework, governance can become fragmented very quickly.
And fragmented governance creates risk. Processes become inconsistent, documentation varies between teams, and it becomes harder to maintain visibility into how AI systems are actually operating across the organization. So, integration with existing quality systems became another important focus area. Rather than creating an entirely separate governance structure, Emma helped integrate AI oversight into the organization's broader compliance and quality management systems.
And that's a really important distinction because AI governance shouldn't sit outside the existing quality framework. It needs to connect back to established processes around validation, documentation, change control, and risk management.
And that's where the conversation started shifting toward operational risk. Because once AI becomes integrated into regulated workflows, organizations need to understand not just how the technology functions, but how failures or inconsistencies could impact the broader operation. And that's where Emma conducted targeted risk assessments around AI enabled processes, looking at areas like system reliability, data integrity risks, cybersecurity exposure, and how AI driven outputs could affect regulated activities.
Because AI systems rely heavily on the quality and consistency of underlying data. If the data is incomplete, biased, or poorly managed, that directly affects the reliability of outputs.
So, governance around data lineage, traceability, and documentation became critical components of the strategy. The organization needed to be able to explain where data originated, how models were trained, how outputs were generated, and how changes were being controlled over time.
And that level of traceability is becoming increasingly important from a regulatory standpoint because regulators are starting to ask more detailed questions around explainability and oversight of AI enabled systems. Not necessarily expecting organizations to reveal proprietary algorithms, but expecting them to demonstrate that the systems are understood and controlled.
And that's where inspection readiness also became part of the conversation. The client needed to prepare teams not just technically, but operationally. How do you answer regulatory questions about AI? How do you explain validation approaches? How do you demonstrate governance during an inspection or submission review? Those are areas where many organizations are still developing maturity.
I agree with you, Eric. And that's what made this engagement broader than a typical technology implementation. Like, it wasn't just about deploying AI, it was about building a governance structure capable of supporting sustainable, compliant adoption over time.
And once the framework started taking shape, the conversation shifted from uncertainty to operational alignment. Instead of different teams approaching AI independently, the organization started establishing a more centralized view of governance and oversight. That created much stronger visibility into how AI systems were being used across research, quality, and operational functions.
And that visibility is really important because one of the biggest challenges with AI adoption is it can scale very quickly. A system that starts in one function can suddenly become connected to multiple workflows, multiple data sets, and multiple decision making processes. Without centralized governance, organizations can lose visibility into where AI is being used and what level of risk is attached to those activities.
And that's where Emma focused heavily on lifecycle management. Not just how models were initially developed, but how they would be monitored, updated, reviewed, and controlled over time. Because long-term oversight is one of the areas regulators are paying much closer attention to. They want to understand not only how systems were validated initially, but how organizations ensure those systems remain reliable as data changes and environments evolve.
And that's especially important with machine learning models because these systems can adapt over time. New data gets introduced, models are retrained, and outputs can shift in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. So the organization needed structured processes around change management and performance monitoring. What qualifies as a meaningful change? When is reassessment required? What level of documentation is expected? Those decisions needed to be standardized.
And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions around AI governance. People sometimes assume governance slows innovation down. But in reality, good governance is what allows organizations to scale innovation more confidently. Because once expectations are clearly defined, teams can move faster without constantly questioning whether systems are aligned with compliance requirements.
Governance creates clarity, and clarity becomes extremely valuable once AI adoption starts expanding across multiple business functions. The client wasn't just implementing one isolated AI tool, they were building broader digital transformation initiatives across the organization. The governance framework needed to be scalable enough to support future growth.
And another important part of the engagement was preparing the organization for regulatory interaction. Because regulators are becoming increasingly interested in how AI systems influence regulated decisions. Organizations need to be prepared to explain not just the technology itself, but the controls surrounding it. That includes validation rationale, data governance practices, oversight responsibilities, and how risks are being monitored over time.
Those conversations can become difficult if teams aren't aligned internally. If one group explains the system differently than another, or if documentation doesn't match operational reality, it creates uncertainty. Emma also worked with the organization to strengthen communication and alignment across functions. Regulatory, quality, operational, and technical teams all understood the governance framework in a consistent way.
And that consistency ultimately strengthened inspection readiness. Because instead of approaching AI as something experimental or disconnected from compliance systems, the organization was able to demonstrate that governance had been intentionally built into the operating model. That creates a very different level of confidence during inspections or regulatory reviews.
And the operational impact extended beyond compliance. The organization improved accountability, strengthened documentation practices, and reduced uncertainty around AI related decision making. Teams had clearer processes for evaluating risk, managing updates, and maintaining oversight. And that created a much stronger foundation for long term adoption.
And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from working with this organization. AI governance is not just about regulatory protection. It's about creating operational structure that allows organizations to scale AI responsibly. Without that structure, adoption can become fragmented and difficult to control. With the right framework in place, organizations can move forward much more confidently.
And that balance between innovation and control is really what defines successful AI adoption in life sciences. Organizations want to take advantage of automation, predictive analytics, and AI driven efficiencies. But at the same time, they need to maintain trust in the systems, trust in the data, and trust in the decisions being made. And that's where governance becomes essential.
Because at the end of the day, regulators are not expecting organizations to avoid AI. They're expecting organizations to understand it, control it, and manage it within a structured quality framework. And companies that build those capabilities early are going to be in a much stronger position as regulatory expectations continue evolving.
That is a great point, Eric. AI adoption across life sciences is only going to continue accelerating. The organizations that succeed long term will be the ones that integrate governance, compliance, and operational oversight into that growth from the beginning rather than trying to retrofit controls later.
And when you look at this project overall, that's really what Emma helped accomplish. Turning what initially felt like regulatory uncertainty into a scalable governance strategy that supported innovation, strengthened oversight, and positioned the organization for sustainable long-term AI adoption. Thank you for joining us for today's deep dive. If your organization needs support, building AI governance frameworks, strengthening compliance oversight, or aligning digital transformation initiatives with regulatory expectations, Emma International is here to help. You can reach us anytime at info@emmainternational.com or visit us at emmainternational.com. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and Spotify so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay innovative.